When you hear the word brand, we may think of logos, fashion labels, or big name companies, but the word has a much older and far more literal origin, one tied not to marketing but to fire. The word comes from Old Norse brandr, meaning a piece of burning wood. By late Middle English, it evolved into a verb meaning to mark permanently with a hot iron. By the 17th century, brand fully came to mean a mark of ownership, usually created through burning. But the practice of branding long existed before the word itself. Archaeological evidence suggests Stone Age humans may have marked livestock with paint or tar. These marks were temporary, but their purpose was clear: identification and ownership. By 2000 BC, ancient civilizations developed a more permanent method: burning. Egyptian funeral monuments over 4,000 years old depict cattle with branded symbols. Branding soon extended beyond animals. Pottery makers in China, India, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome began marketing their ceramics with unique engravings 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. These marks told a story of who made the item, what it was made from, and where it came from. Now that we've set the historical stage, you're welcome, by the way. It's time for the juicy part: how branding evolved into celebrity advertising. One of the earliest recorded examples of celebrity endorsement comes from 1760s England. Josiah Wedgwood, founder of Wedgwood Pottery, secured a royal endorsement from Queen Charlotte. He branded his luxury chinaware as Queensware. The result: prestige, trust, and booming sales. Historians credit Wedgwood with laying the foundations of modern brand strategy. By the 19th century, advertising evolved into collectible trade cards. These featured celebrities from stage and sport alongside promoted products. Notable early endorsers include Lily Langtry, Sarah Bernhardt, Babe Ruth, and Ty Cobb. Then later, we also had Mark Twain, who was the first multi-brand celebrity endorser. Mark Twain, beloved author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, lent his name to whiskey, cigars, flour, fountain pens, shaving tools, and clothing. His credibility as a public intellectual helped legitimize new products, making him, as we've said, arguably the first multi-brand ambassador in history. Then followed the early 1900s, where cigarette brands became aggressive adopters of celebrity ads. Stars like Henry Fonda, Jack Benny, Fred Astaire, and Marlene Dietrich pitched cigarettes in glamorous campaigns. Ronald Reagan, before politics, endorsed Chesterfield cigarettes, once declaring, quote-unquote, "I'm sending Chesterfields to all my friends. That's the merriest Christmas any smoker can have. Chesterfield mildness plus no unpleasant aftertaste." These ads were polished, seductive, and often deceptive, especially as health concerns grew. Now that we've understood the historical context of what branding used to be and how it evolved, let us now move to the modern day. In today's marketing world, brands don't just sell products, they sell personalities, values, and stories. A psychological principle called balance theory explains why this works. We tend to like what the people we like. If you admire a celebrity and they support a brand, your brain naturally transfers the positive feeling to the brand. The reverse is also true. If the celebrity's image suffers, the brand's image can collapse alongside it. One perfect example that we can talk about is Sydney Sweeney. When American Eagle made Sydney Sweeney the face of its new denim campaign, sales jumped and social media buzzed. It looked like a perfect match. Youth appeal meets a brand trying to reclaim cultural relevance. Then came the backlash. Critics accused the slogan "Pretty Jeans" of promoting exclusionary ideals. So the balance theory is seen in this way. At first, Sweeney's action transferred her audience's goodwill to the brand. Controversy disrupted the triangle of audience, celebrity, and brand. Some fans distanced themselves, others doubled down in defense. The same psychological bond that boosted the brand also made the fallout swift and severe. With that said, as in the case with Sydney Sweeney, we can say that to some extent, to some degree, it lacks authenticity. In today's world, authenticity drives influence. Audiences prefer creators who feel real over celebrities with distant, polished personas. Influencer marketing now spans mega influencers, macro influencers, and micro influencers. And the thing is that people trust people, especially those who seem relatable, as in the case Mason MKSI, Logan Paul, Mr. Beast, your favorite YouTuber, and this is the embodiment of the subject matter, or rather this segment, because long-term partnerships with influencers who generally use a product creates stronger connection than one of ads.
Consumerism is related to the predominantly Keynesian idea that consumer spending is the key driver of the economy and that encouraging consumers to spend is a major policy goal. From this point of view, consumerism is a positive phenomenon that fuels economic growth. Others view the drive to obtain more material possessions as problematic, causing individual anxiety and eroding the social fabric. In this video, ladies and gentlemen, I want us to try and understand where all of this comes from. Why has there been a negative rise of consumerism in modern culture? Why are we in the era of trying to fit in, showing off, and yet broke? Why buy the biggest burger or cookie just for the sake of? Long before Amazon and TikTok hauls, even before shopping malls and glossy magazines, the seeds of consumerism were planted in the 17th and 18th centuries. International trade was booming, cities were growing, people weren't just buying what they needed, they were beginning to buy what they wanted. In France, the first fashion magazines emerged in the 1670s. By the 1770s, almanacs and pocketbooks were filled with product ads. The marketplace was evolving not just in supply but in desire. By the 1800s, the shift was already tremendous because, in the obvious, man is subject to evolution in every aspect. And in this time, in 1891, a man called Edward Louis Bernays was born, a pioneer and a forefather in this consumerism space and public relations. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he heavily borrowed from Freud's theory that humans are not primarily rational, but driven by unconscious desires and emotions, fear, love, status, coitus, and etc. Bernays believed that if you wanted to influence public behavior, you had to appeal to their subconscious, not their logic. He coined this phrase to describe the process of shaping public opinion through calculated media campaigns. This was not just about informing people, it was about guiding them without the awareness, like a puppeteer with strings they can't see.
Edward L. Bernays, you're the father of public relations. What led you more than 60 years ago to see the need for public relations?
I was a member of the United States Committee on Public Information in World War I, and I worked with the committee to make this the war to end all wars, which was Wilson's idea, and the war to make the world safe for democracy, and to popularize throughout the world the 14 points. And I found that ideas were weapons and were even more effective than bullets.
This now anticipates what we now call behavioral economics, nudge theory, and even algorithmic targeting on social media. After World War I, Bernays realized that propaganda had become a dirty word, so he rebranded it as public relations.
When I came back to the United States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Another interesting fact is that the bad people from Germany at the time, led by the infamous leader at that time, adopted this principle for their malicious purposes by literally brainwashing individuals in the country in that era. If you want to read more about that, I have placed an article that goes deeper about this whole science. And in the same regard, why don't you subscribe for more thought-provoking content? I'm really trying to make YouTube a full-time thing. After World War II, consumption exploded.
Every Friday night, Julia's job is to compare the grocery prices of our neighborhood stores for Saturday morning shopping.
Governments encouraged spendings, corporations flooded the market with new products.
Ice-cold Coca-Cola will be a mighty welcome sight when you return.
Yes, my lord, it's a party tonight. We'll have Tootsie Roll Pop.
The prettiest, yes, the prettiest heads in town are turning to Shasta for a hot cream shampoo.
Ads told families owning a home, a car, a fridge, that was the American dream. Shopping wasn't just economic, it was patriotic, it was personal. At the time, we weren't just buying goods, we were buying happiness, but not everyone bought in, of course. Philosopher Herbert Marcuse called it voluntary servitude. He argued that we work harder to buy more, to feel a fleeting sense of satisfaction, only to return to work again. The cycle benefits someone, but is it us? Others, of course, when hearing this, pushed back in different ways, as this is the norm with man when it comes with controversy. And so this, of course, shows that man embraces consumption even while aware of its contradictions, because in a world that feels uncertain, owning things feels like control. Am I not wrong, ladies and gentlemen? By the 1980s, consumerism was louder than ever. Malls weren't just places to shop, they were social hubs. Women were joining the workforce in record numbers, doubling household incomes and spending power. TV shows dictated fashion trends. People weren't just keeping up with the Joneses, they were trying to outshine them. It was all about more and more. Then came the revolution, technology. Personal computers entered homes. In the 90s, the internet became a norm used by many households. Suddenly, you didn't have to leave your house to shop. The world came to your screen. E-commerce exploded. Sites like eBay and Amazon gave everyday people the power to sell and buy globally. With one click, a product in Tokyo could be in New York within days. And with this inconvenience came a deeper shift. Consumerism was no longer tied to place. It became tied to time. Instant access, instant gratification. All of these then leading up to the modern 21st century, the world we live in today. In a matter of just 40 years or so, the tech shift has seen exponential growth like never before. It is right we look at the familiars, and one perfect example being social media applications. An interesting article with the title "The Platformization of Consumer Culture" brings more nuance in the subject matter at hand. It states that in today's world, almost everything we do as consumers, what we buy, how we shop, even how we express ourselves, is shaped by one thing: digital platforms. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Amazon, YouTube, you name it. These aren't just apps anymore. They've become marketplaces, social spaces, and ad billboards, all wrapped into one. This takeover of our daily lives by digital platforms has a name: platformization. And you may be asking, what does that even mean? Well, platformization is when platforms become the main stage where our culture plays out. They're where we shop, talk, share opinions, discover trends, and even protest. Think about it. You don't Google a brand anymore, you TikTok it. You don't call customer service, you tweet a complaint. You don't just buy shoes, you show them off in a story or a video haul. And in doing so, you're not just being a customer, you're being watched, analyzed, and predicted. See, platforms like Instagram or TikTok give us free tools to create, post, and connect. But nothing is really free. Everything you do, every click, scroll, like, and share is turned into data. Data that tells platforms who you are, what you want, and how to sell to you. This is what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism has claimed something from outside the market and brought it into the market to sell and buy. But in this case, the territory that it has claimed is private human experience, to be sold and purchased as behavioral data.
A system that doesn't just respond to a behavior, it shapes it. It nudges you towards trends, products, opinions, all while quietly profiting from attention. But this is not just about shopping, it's about culture. These platforms influence what we think is cool, what success looks like, even how we present ourselves. Ever noticed how everyone's aesthetic starts to look the same? Same poses, same edits, same brands? Am I right or am I right? That is no accident. It's standardization. Platforms subtly guiding our behavior into predictable patterns they can sell to advertisers. And yet these trends don't last. What's viral today is cringe tomorrow. I mean, why do you think people are always calling certain influencers and celebrities washed after being the face of the industry for a certain period of time? So, welcome to the world of ephemerality, where everything's fast, fleeting, and always chasing the next thing. But it goes deeper, ladies and gentlemen. The way we form communities online around influencers, hobbies, even brands is changing. They are what researchers call hybrid publics. I know that's a very interesting way to put it, right? These are people connected not by direct interaction, but by shared attention to the same influencer or brand. A perfect example being YouTube and streaming. Need I say more, guys? Mr. Beast, Kaisanat, come on, man. Like, there's plenty of names that you can give or like examples, you get me? And platforms love this because it means more engagement, more data, more power. And even in this ultra digital world, physical things still matter. Showing off those shoes you bought, filming unboxes, joining a TikTok challenge with your new outfit, these are real products being used to gain digital attention. So while platforms may seem intangible, they still rely on the very material world of stuff we're encouraged to buy, use, post, and move on from. And you, the viewer, you may be seated there and asking yourself, why is this guy preaching to me all this, man? I don't care, I just want to live my life. It means we're not just users, we're consumers, creators, and data sources all at once. Platforms shape what we desire and then sell that desire right back to us. We may feel free, but the game is designed to keep us scrolling, buying, posting, and repeating. And the question is, are we okay with that?
Poverty can be understood as a condition in which a person or group does not have enough money or resources to live at a level considered normal or acceptable in society. At its core, poverty is about lacking the means to meet life needs, but what those needs are can vary depending on context. To define poverty clearly, one must first determine what counts as basic need. These are two main ways to define needs. The narrow definition of poverty focuses on the essentials required for survival, such as food, shelter, and clothing. Under this view, a person living on the edge of starvation or without proper protection from the elements is considered poor. On the other hand, the broader definition extends beyond survival to include living standards. In this sense, people may not be starving, but if their housing, food, or clothing falls far below what the majority of society enjoys, they are still considered poor. While poverty is directly about resources, it is often tied to other challenges. Poor health, lack of education, unemployment, and even higher crime rates are commonly associated with poverty. However, these are not poverty itself. Rather, they are consequences that result from it. When people cannot meet their basic needs, it affects every other part of life, limiting opportunities and creating cycles that are difficult to escape. Historically, poverty was accepted as an unavoidable part of human life. In pre-industrial societies, total economic production was simply too low to provide everyone with a comfortable living, even if resources had been distributed equally. However, with the rise of industrialization, the situation changed. Modern economies began producing enough goods and services to support entire populations at much higher standards of living. In this new context, poverty was no longer a matter of absolute scarcity, but an equal distribution. Poverty has been a constant presence throughout human history. For thousands of years, the majority of humanity lived in conditions that will be described today as extreme poverty. Frequent hunger, limited access to food, short lifespans, and high levels of disease and mortality. However, the story of poverty is not a simple one. Its causes and development varied widely across continents and centuries, shaped by geography, climate, disease, wars, colonialism, and economic systems. The average person had little security, with food supplies tied directly to weather, harvests, and local conditions. Epidemics were common and survival itself was often uncertain. Yet, geographical and climatic differences meant that some regions were better equipped than others to support human growth. Eurasia, for instance, had fertile soil and large domesticable animals. These conditions allowed farming and livestock to flourish, giving populations greater access to protein-rich diets, which supported human health, physical strength, and ultimately productivity. In contrast, regions with harsher climates or fewer natural resources face greater barriers to prosperity. In Europe, repeated epidemics over centuries such as the Black Death devastated populations but also created long-term immunity within surviving communities. By contrast, populations in the Americas and parts of Africa did not develop the same immunity. When Europeans arrived during the Age of Exploration, they brought diseases like smallpox, which decimated Native American populations who had no resistance. This demographic collapse not only caused immense suffering, but also left these societies vulnerable to conquest and colonization, deepening patterns of poverty and exploitation that lasted for centuries. European nations expanded their empires across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, reorganizing local economies to serve the needs of colonizers. Recent research by scholars suggests that colonial powers pursue different economic models that shaped long-term outcomes. Spain followed a mercantilist model, concentrating wealth in the hands of a small elite, which created deep inequality and dependence in much of Latin America. Britain, on the other hand, adopted a more liberal model in some colonies, promoting trade and property rights. This helped countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia develop strong economies, although many African and Asian colonies were still left impoverished. I am taking you guys into these different realms to be able to understand how things work. So bear with me if maybe you're not putting one and two together. After this whole essay, you're going to be able to understand it fully, okay? By the 1800s, the global population was about 1 billion people, and nearly all of them were poor modern standards. Data shows that around 94% of the world's population lived in less than $2 a day, and 84% on less than $1 a day. Industrialization began to change this in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, but inequality also grew. In urban centers like New York, slums such as Five Points housed impoverished communities, with child mortality rates 3 times higher than elsewhere. The 20th century brought progress and setbacks. Extreme poverty declined in wealthy countries like Japan, Canada, and the United States, whereby 2000 less than 5% of people lived on less than $1.25 a day. However, a global inequality between rich and poor nations widened as developing countries experienced much slower economic growth, Africa in particular. For example, Eritrea, once relatively developed under Italian colonialism, saw its economy collapse after decades of war for independence, leaving half of its households in poverty by the early 1990s. After World War II, poverty became a global political concern. New international institutions such as the UN, World Bank, and IMF launched programs to fight poverty and promote development. UNICEF and the Food and Agriculture Organization worked to improve health, nutrition, and education. In 2000, the UN introduced the Millennium Development Goals (MDGs), a landmark effort to cut global poverty, hunger, and disease. By 2050, the number of people living in extreme poverty had been reduced from nearly 2 billion to around 836 million, a historic achievement. How they measure that, I do not know, but I guess they know their thing, right? Despite these successes, the 21st century has seen new challenges. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009, rising food prices, and political conflicts all slowed progress. Many developing countries faced food shortages when global commodity prices rose sharply. showing how vulnerable the poor remain to global economic shocks. By 2017, about 750 million people still lived in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $1.90 a day. Imagine that. With that brief historical analytical breakdown, let us now get into the core of the subject matter at hand, and in this case exploring why poverty will not end in the modern world. In this segment, we'll be looking at two arguments that try to explain this phenomenon. One side is more philosophical and the other is politically stretched. Jeffrey Sachs, in his influential book The End of Poverty, written in 2005, argues that humanity has the tools, knowledge, and resources to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. In contrast, Sandra Bakers, in his essay Why Poverty Will Not End, contends that poverty is fundamentally inescapable not because of scarcity but because of human choice and ethical failure. Jeffrey Sachs built his argument on three pillars: empirical progress, economic potential, and global cooperation. First, Sachs demonstrates that extreme poverty has already been declining at an unprecedented rate. In 1820, more than 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. By the early 2000s, that number had fallen below 20%. This trend, Sachs argues, proves that poverty is not a permanent condition of humanity, but a transitional stage in development. Second, Sachs identifies what he calls the poverty trap. For people and countries stuck at survival or subsistence levels, small disadvantages such as lack of food, poor health, or inadequate infrastructure prevent them from generating the capital needed to invest in future growth. Yet Sachs believes this trap can be overcome through targeted investments in healthcare, education, technology, and infrastructure. By, he said, quote-unquote, priming the pump, the poor can climb onto the ladder of development and achieve self-sustaining growth. Third, Sachs emphasizes the role of collective global action. He argues that wealthy nations can afford to dedicate just a fraction of their GDP to development aid without sacrificing their own prosperity. According to his calculations, less than 1% of the income of rich nations could provide the resources needed to eliminate extreme poverty. In his view, the real obstacle is not feasibility but political will. Thus, Sachs presents poverty eradication as both economically possible and morally imperative. Without going in further, if you want to oppose what Sachs has stated or rather said, please do put them down in the comments. And if you want an answer from me personally, I'm gonna give my own answer, right? Now let us move to Sandra Baker's argument. His argument rests on a provocative claim. Poverty is not an absolute condition that can be ended, but a relative state that will always exist in unequal societies. Even if every person in the world suddenly received $1 million, some will still be considered poor in comparison to those with more. For Bakers, poverty persists because it is defined relationally, not absolutely. Bakers goes further by asserting that humanity chooses not to end extreme poverty. He reasons that if it is within our power to save people dying from hunger or preventable disease with minimal sacrifice, but we consistently fail to do so, then the conclusion is unavoidable. We do not truly want to end poverty. The real problem, he argues, is not scarcity of resources, but scarcity of will. This moral contradiction, professing to care about poverty while refusing to take sufficient action, is the foundation of his pessimism. Additionally, Bakers rejects the idea that appeals to ethics alone will work. He notes that humans are constrained by self-interest, limited altruism, and cultural conditioning. Unlike Sachs, who believes external aid and innovation can overcome the poverty trap, Bakers insists that ethical weakness ensures such solutions will always. Both recognize that wealthier societies have the resources necessary to reduce suffering dramatically, and both agree that moral responsibility plays a role. Sachs frames aid as an ethical imperative, while Bakers frames the lack of aid as evidence of ethical failure. Moreover, both thinkers highlight the role of systems rather than isolated individuals. Sachs sees systems of aid, technology transfer, and policy coordinations as engines of poverty reduction, while Bakers sees systems of inequality, global capitalism, and ethical weakness as barriers to true progress. Now let's come to the main divergence, right? This lies in possibility versus inevitability. Sachs views poverty as an economic and technical problem that can be solved with enough resources, coordination, and political will. Bakers views it as an eternal moral and social problem, inseparable from inequality itself. Another point of divergence is their treatment of ethics. Sachs assumes that once the case for ending poverty is rationally demonstrated, leaders and nations will act accordingly. Bakers dismisses this optimism, arguing that people prioritize comfort, consumption, and self-interest over the distant suffering of strangers. Thus, where Sachs appeals to our better angels, Bakers emphasizes our moral shortcomings. Finally, Sachs sees history as progressive. Poverty is declining, and continued innovation can accelerate its decline. Bakers, by contrast, views history as repetitive. Poverty persists in different forms because inequality and selfishness are constants of human society. So you may be asking which perspective is more convincing. This will depend on where you come from, right? Because Sachs' argument is inspiring, grounded in historical evidence of poverty reduction and concrete strategies for future progress, right? Yet his optimism may underestimate the depth of political inertia, corruption, and inequality that shape global systems. His reliance on aid as a solution also risks creating dependency unless paired with structural reforms. Baker's argument is powerful in its moral clarity, but it risks fatalism. By insisting poverty will never end, he may discourage action and resign humanity to accept injustice. Moreover, his focus on ethics over structure neglects the possibility that systemic reforms such as fairer trade policies, debt relief, or institutional development can reduce inequality even if poverty in a relative sense persists. A synthesis of the two perspectives may be most useful. Baker's is correct that poverty in a relative sense will always exist as long as inequality exists. However, Sachs is right that extreme poverty, the condition of living without basic needs, can be eliminated. This challenge is distinguished between absolute and relative poverty, and then setting realistic but ambitious goals to eradicate extreme poverty while reducing inequality. As we conclude the debate between Jeffrey Sachs and Sandra Bakers, we can say that poverty may never end. In the absolute sense, Bakers critiques, we can say that humanity may never create a perfectly equal world, but it can create one where no one dies of hunger, preventable disease, or lack of basic resources. The real question is not whether poverty can end, but whether humanity will choose to make its most extreme forms a relic of history. The 21st century is characterized by unprecedented levels of wealth alongside persistent and, in some cases, deepening global poverty. The annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, epitomizes this paradox. While the world's wealthiest and most influential leaders gather to discuss solutions to pressing global issues, reports consistently shows that wealth inequality continues to worsen. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% of the global population captured nearly 2/3 of the $42 trillion in new wealth generated since 2020. By contrast, the remaining 99% shared less than half of that growth. This raises an urgent question. What if billionaires who now hold resources comparable to nation states directly contributed to alleviating or even ending poverty? Let us put the numbers into perspective, right? Today, there are more than 2,700 billionaires with a combined fortune of over $13 trillion. If they contribute just 1% of their wealth each year, a tiny fraction less than the annual returns of their investments, they could generate about $130 billion annually. That is enough to eradicate extreme poverty worldwide, which costs around $95 billion a year, or end world hunger estimated at $39 to $50 billion annually, or even fund climate resilience for the most vulnerable nations. In other words, billionaires now hold enough wealth to solve problems one thought solvable by only governments. So why does poverty persist? This goes hand in hand with my previous video, right? Part of the answer lies in responsibility. For billionaires, 5% of their wealth is negligible. For the poor, it's life-changing. Morally, the argument is clear, but even pragmatically, lifting people out of poverty benefits everyone. When the poor join the middle class, they become consumers. They drive demand, buy products, and fuel economic growth. In Africa, for example, the middle class has already tripled in the past 3 decades, but 2/3 of Africans still remain poor or vulnerable. Imagine the global impact if that changed. Of course, philanthropy isn't new. From Andrew Carnegie's library to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, history shows how wealthy individuals can shape education, health, and society, but charity alone is not enough. If billionaires truly wanted to end poverty, their money must be invested in systems such as schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and sustainable agriculture. Not one-time donations, but institutions that can endure forever. And yet, there's the reality that not all billionaires will step up. Voluntary giving is uncertain. That's why groups like Oxfam argue for wealth taxation. A modest global tax of just 2 to 5% of billionaires could raise trillions of dollars each year, enough to tackle hunger, poverty, climate change, and more. Because if billionaires won't act willingly, the world may soon insist they act through policy. So let's return to our question. What if billionaires ended poverty? The truth is they could. With even a fraction of their wealth, they could eliminate extreme poverty, reduce hunger, as we've said, expand the global middle class, and stabilize fragile regions. Such action will not only fulfill a moral duty but also create pragmatic benefits, fostering sustainable growth and reducing global instability. Either way, the future stability and prosperity of the global system will depend on addressing the imbalance between immense wealth and persistent poverty. In a world where billionaires can now do what once only governments could, their responsibility has never been greater. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the end of the series. Thank you guys for tuning in. Tell me what you've learned. Was I right? Was I wrong? These are all hypotheticals. This is a space to talk about these hard topics that maybe many people don't want to talk about, and I feel like it is my responsibility as a youth, as a Gen Z who is growing up in these tough times, to try and make us think critically about the world, right? Maybe in my next video I may do something about what the world can learn from Singapore, how African countries can learn to alleviate themselves from how they're stuck to somewhere greater, right? Anyway, that's just an idea, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.